I didn't think I was ever going to be shut down. That's stupid to say that, but you know, you just feel like it's not going to happen.
It'll never happen to me. It'll happen to them, but we were all so proud of ourselves we were never going to have to parachute.
No flyer really expects to bail out. Like a heart attack or a car accident, it may happen to someone else, but not to me, not today. Every one of the thousands of flyers who went down in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts felt that way. Denial is as common as coffee and flying boots in a combat squadron.
The other missions that come through and they'd say you're going tomorrow and you're okay, and you maybe wrote letters and went to bed early. But that night when they came through, I felt a chill come over me, which was different. And I don't know whether I had a premonition or what, but no, as I said before, I was the optimist, you know. I wasn't going to get killed. I knew at our base nobody had finished 25 missions. So it wasn't a question of if we were going to get shot down, it was when. And you just said, I hope I'm not injured or killed.
I guess the most disheartening thing was that I saw so many airplanes blow up that day. And when the war was over, it turns out that of the 109 of us missing in action that day from my base, 46 were reported as killed in action, and 62 ended up as prisoners of war. I was the only one out of the 109 that came back.
Like the tradition of denial, important human elements in the experience of a downed flyer have remained much the same over time. And World War II provided a wealth of information about dealing with that experience. In the European theater alone, thousands of service members, mostly flyers, found themselves behind enemy lines and returned successfully without being captured. Almost all of these successful evaders benefited from the networks of underground helpers. These networks, or escape lines, were already in existence by the time the United States entered the war, thanks to efforts of the British Intelligence Service and to the courage of thousands of citizens in Nazi-occupied countries like Holland, Belgium, Poland, Yugoslavia, and France. Among these lines were the Shelburne Line, headed by Canadian Lucien Dumais, the Comet Line, headed by 24-year-old Dédé Dujon of Belgium, the Pat O'Leary Line, headed by Albert Giris, a Belgian Army doctor, the Burgundy Line, headed by French officer Georges Brusin, and the Dutch Paris Line, headed by Dutch Army Captain John Henry Widener. Today, other networks in the form of helicopter-borne rescue teams often perform the work of the World War II underground. But the immediate human experience of a downed flyer has changed very little. Since World War I, in fact, flyers who have gone down behind enemy lines have had to cope with injury, loneliness, thirst, and urgent needs for concealment and navigation. Successful evaders in World War II faced those challenges during the hours, days, or months before an underground network took them in. And combat air crews of the future will share the same experience. Paul Kenny was a bombardier whose plane crash-landed in northern France after bombing a target in Germany. He successfully evaded the Germans for 81 days before being turned over to the Gestapo by a collaborator.
A radio operator got a 303 through his arm. Now, it didn't break a bone or anything, but it was pretty bad. and he was scared to death. He was just a kid, my gosh. I don't even know if he was old enough to fly. But he started running toward the back of the door, pulled it off the pins. You know how they come off when pulling the pins out of hinges. Pulled them off and attempted to parachute at treetop level. Well, we wrestled for a while. Got him settled down. I was sitting on his legs with a little hunting knife I carried, cutting away his suit so I could put a tourniquet on his arm. Worked out okay, except a 20-meter shell came in the back end, right through the whole rear end, exploded right in their face. He got ripped open from his collarbone to his crotch.
Evasions in enemy territory usually begin with an injury. A NATO study shows that about 60% of aircrew members who have to bail out or crash land are injured by the time they get away from their parachute or wrecked aircraft. And nearly 100% of them experience injury or illness at some time before they are rescued. The same flak, missile, or gunfire that disables an aircraft may hit occupants as well and may cause a fire or explosion inside the plane. At 5:30 on the morning of June 21, 1944, Al Lee took off from a base in England as a B-17 navigator in the first shuttle bombing raid of World War II. His mission was to attack targets in Germany and then fly on to a secret base in Poltava, Russia. After bombing a German target, he was shot down over Poland. Taken in by Polish freedom fighters, he fought alongside them for over a month before meeting a contingent of the Russian army and being flown back to England.
Too fat is 6 o'clock up, coming in.
When we were attacked by the 109, the left inboard engine was hit, and then the inboard right engine was hit, and both were on fire. A cannon shell had torn open the bottom of the wing on the left side and had dislodged one of the fuel tanks. And in this attack, the plane finally wound up in a very violent flat spin. And just before I left the airplane, the airspeed was way over 250, and that was really moving in a B-17, and especially in a flat spin. And most of the men were thrown about the inside the airplane. Some of them had small fragment wounds, and that. Of the 10 of us, 7 were injured in one way or another. 3 so badly they were taken prisoner. They could not escape from the Germans. But my pilot, in the holding the airplane so everybody could get out as best he could, was the last one to leave the plane, and it tore his right arm. The force of the motion of the aircraft pulled the wheel pulled forward and pulled his right arm out of the socket at the shoulder. And he was able to get out of the plane and open his chute and didn't remember anything until he was on the ground. The wall turret gunner took it the worst. The 109 came up from about 10 o'clock low, very low, climbing at about a 60-degree angle. And he just strafed the bottom of the airplane, of course, getting those 2 engines and the ball turret. And the men in the back were able to get the ball turret pointing down so they could get him back into the plane. The way with the configuration, you had to have the guns down and open the door. They got him up in the plane, and one of the men jumped with him and pulled his ripcord for him, put his parachute on, and then pulled his ripcord for him and fell away and then opened his own chute.
Robert Sweat flew 17 missions as a tail gunner in a B-24, including the first Ploesti mission, in which over half of the planes failed to return. He was the only survivor when his plane was shot down over France after bombing its target in Germany. The French underground helped him get to the beach at Pluha, where a British vessel picked him up and took him back to England.
After I pulled the ripcord, I felt real good, you know. Oh, I thought I'd make it. Then I noticed the blood was squirting from my neck, squirting out and hitting my hand. And that's kind of frightening too. And each pulsate of my heart, boy, that blood is squirting out there. So I reached up and I could feel the hole up there. And I held it together until I hit the ground. Then I stuffed it full of mud. That's all I could do. There was no pain at all. And I noticed I had been shot here in my thumb, and I could see the leaders there in my hand after I hit. There was no blood. Of course, I was just solid. I was just really had blood all over me. So this man told me in France, or he said, "You were a bloody mess." But there was no blood in my. I guess I bled so much I didn't have any. I could see those white leaders in my thumb when I'd work it. It's about half severed, you know, just moving back and forth. But there was no blood. I think I was so frightened until I don't believe I've ever been any calmer in my life than I was up there before I even pulled the ripcord. I don't know how to explain it, but I really was. I was calm. And yet, when I told this before, when I hit the ground, I think I was as wet with perspiration as if you poured a gallon of water on me. So you can imagine what kind of strain a person is under.
A plane in flight is, after all, a metal vehicle with interior and exterior protrusions traveling hundreds of miles per hour. So simply getting out of it often causes injuries to arms or legs. And rocket-propelled ejections involve a rapid acceleration that can cause back and neck injuries. Ed Miller was a 24-year-old B-24 pilot on his 5th combat mission when he bailed out over France after bombing a target in Germany. He landed near a radio station and spent 5 weeks by himself before the underground took him in. Like almost 90% of the successful evaders, he eventually escaped over the Pyrenees into Spain.
They had told us, bombing a target, you're here, the target's here, and the Germans are going to put up a wall of flak in between. So just fly straight and level. The shortest distance is a straight line, and the bombardiers can aim better. So you looked ahead and you saw this big black cloud up there, and you say, okay, let's see if we come out the other side. Well, we lost one engine on the way in. We lost another engine over the target. And they also hit our oxygen system and the hydraulics. And the waist gunner was telling me he was sitting there with flak jackets around him, watching holes pop up through the wings. And I talked to one of the fellas later, and he told me that they bailed out through a hole in the floor because it was bigger than the window, so why bother going to the bomb bay? And now we were really a straggler, and we were off on our own, and we were just gradually losing altitude. We got hit again after leaving the target. We got another engine, got hit, and it was running, but not well. We probably lost a couple of cylinders. And then we flew about 2 hours, and we'd gotten down to about 13,000 feet. And we went over an area that probably had about 3 guns, and they managed to hit the 4th engine, and it started to burn, and we said, well, we're not going to go any further. 24 is not a glider. So, well, as I say, it was terrific turbulence. And then it broke out, and you end up flying, you're going with your head lower than your feet, and you're on your back. It seems to be where if you're completely relaxed, and it's like standing on a hilltop with a gentle breeze going by. It's a very nice feeling. And actually it got boring in a way. I put an arm out to see what would happen, and all of a sudden I says, where's the ground? And uh-oh. And I opened the parachute and hit the ground.
When I went down to the front hatch to go out, when I bailed out, our bombardier was still sitting in the nose. And so after all that attack, my first question was to go to him and ask him if he was all right or if he had been shot. And he said, no, I'm all right. And I said, you should have been gone. And he said, I'll follow you. And I didn't realize that I was looking at a man which was frozen with fear. And when he jumped, he never pulled his ripcord. The Dutch people found the body and reported that to me.
And all of a sudden, I heard the top turret fire 2 short bursts, just brrr, brrr. And then FW-190s, of course, I found out later, hit us. I mean, they just poured those 20 millimeters right into the cockpit. And the whole plane just started mushing. There was a loud spewing sound. Like you dropped all the flaps and landing gear, just kind of stopped, and everything had a tendency to move forward. And of course, I reached down for my chute. My left arm I'd been shot in the head, it just useless. And I had to pick up my chute. Those old hang type chest types, and they're hard to get on with 2 hands, plus your oxygen mask and everything else. But I managed to do it. And I glanced out the window. Now, this all happened, I'd say, within a period of 6 to 8 seconds. I mean, it was fast. I glanced out the window, and the number 4 engine, I believe, in the right, and the wing tip was out there. It already came off burning. The plane flipped over and went into a flat spin. And it threw me over to the left waist window. And I got my chute and my head out in the slipstream, and I couldn't stand it. I mean, the acceleration was so great. And it was like a siren going. It was going, you know, like that. And then there was a terrific explosion, and then it was deathly quiet. I couldn't see. It's black dark, and I knew I had to do something. And of course, immediately I reached up for my eyes, and my oxygen mask had been slid across my eyes. Probably ought to save my eyes. And when I pulled that off, then I was in the junkyard up there. There was flak suits and machine guns and pieces of that B-24, just a junkyard up there. Of course, I couldn't tell I was moving. And I looked down, and my pockets had been ripped off, and they were just a-flopping. And that's the only way I could tell I was moving. And I looked through my legs, and I see the earth down there kind of spinning. And so I started to pull my ripcord. And I had 3 pair of gloves on, and I couldn't. So I pulled my gloves off with my teeth, and then I pulled my ripcord. And that's a good feeling. It's like a big man grabs you by the shirt collar and jerks you across the room. But it sure felt good.
Ankle and leg injuries may occur during parachute landings.
That is one heck of a shock. That's a snap, very hard. And as I say, I was right at ground level. So when I swung down and hit the ground, I was going backwards. I sprained my ankle very badly. I bounced over a very small tree and landed on my back on a rock. And I hurt so much all over that if somebody had walked up and says, "I'm going to shoot you," I would have said, "Thank you," and hurry up. Well, with the ankle, when I was walking, it was so swollen. I had the leather flying boot on this foot, and I couldn't zip it up. On the other foot, I had 2 socks, the electric boot and the leather boot, and they were kind of floppy on my foot, so you can guess the size of my ankle.
Traveling on foot through unknown territory brings its own risks of injury and illness.
After a couple of days, I met somebody that gave me a pair of shoes. Well, they weren't shoes. They had like a coil rope bottom and thongs, and they were about 2 sizes too big for me. So my feet would slide back and forth on those. And that's where I left the flying boots and the electric boots. And as I say, because of that, I got blisters that just kept forming and breaking. My feet were bleeding all the time.
In every conflict, flyers must consider the possibility that they will have to overcome pain and sickness while evading an enemy. They may have to treat the injury or illness of a fellow flyer, and they may have to make an agonizing decision about what to do with someone who is too sick or hurt to travel. Ralph Patton was a B-17 pilot who bailed out over France on January 5, 1944, after attacking a German airfield near Bordeaux. Eventually, the Shelburne line of the French underground took him in and delivered him to Bonaparte Beach. There, he boarded a British naval vessel that carried him across the channel to freedom.
Our left waist gunner was given a pair of shoes that did not fit very well, and so he developed blisters on his feet within the first 2 days. And this was torturous for him and for us. We didn't know whether to force him to keep coming or to drop him off somewhere. I think as the end result, we would have been better had we turned him loose to a French farmhouse or something, and then we'd have gone on our way. But he was in agony with every step, and I still think back on that and think we made a mistake in forcing him to come on, but you do what you think's right at the time. The first pilot and I talked about it several times, and I think the decision was pretty joint. We felt that we would be better off to keep him with us than to cut him adrift. We tried to help him as best we could, but how do you help a guy with blisters on his feet? So I look back on that as a very tough episode, and sometimes I berate myself for not being more forceful in the situation, but what's the best thing then seems like that's the way you go.
He couldn't walk. We couldn't carry him. What are we going to do? There's just nothing we could do right then. We didn't have the strength to carry him. We thought maybe he couldn't live. Infection so badly that he couldn't live. We thought maybe we'd saved him. To this day, if he were still alive, and I don't know if he is or not, he was mad at us. We left him behind. He was that alert, so he knew he was being refined. It hurt, too, to leave him behind.
Successful evasions often begin with first aid, as a flyer takes care of an injury suffered during a bailout or crash landing. After dealing with immediate medical needs, every flyer soon confronts other stresses, both physiological and psychological. The psychological stress of being alone in enemy territory can be even greater than the stress of air combat. Many flyers have reported that the speed of events during air combat demanded such intense involvement that they felt no fear at all while it was happening. But after a bailout or crash landing in enemy territory, fear, anxiety, and loneliness are almost certain. World War II evaders had several ways of dealing with psychological stress. Clayton David was a B-17 pilot on his third combat mission on January 11, 1944. During his return to England after bombing a target in Germany and withstanding 2.5 hours of continuous fighter attack, he was shot down over Holland. He stayed in safe houses in Holland, Belgium, and France, and eventually escaped over the Pyrenees into Spain.
There were always times when you wondered a little bit because you killed so much time. Things couldn't move fast enough for you, you know. And you're spending 2 weeks without moving, 3 weeks without going anywhere. It kind of eats at you a little bit if you haven't developed some patience.
And all the time I was there, I was so depressed I could hardly, terribly. But what I do, I could remember every mission, the type of bomb, whether it was a 500-pound heavy, or if it was fragmentation or phosphorus, whatever it was. I could remember each mission right from the beginning to end, where we went, how the hits were.
Well, I kept thinking about my crew. I didn't see how any of them could get out, and that worried me more than anything else. And seeing Saunders, the gunner, on the other gunner, falling like that, you know, that you never forget something like that. Most of them burned in plane, and I believe the tail gunner the tail broke off, and they didn't find him for, I think it's a week or two later. I heard that Saunders was found, I think, about a week or so later, just in the trees. I'm sure, you know, just free fall.
Physiological stresses come from the body's continuing need for food, water, sleep, and protection from cold and heat. A fortunate evader may be rescued right away before exhausting the food and water in a survival kit, and before having to deal with the potentially deadly effects of fatigue or exposure to excessive cold or heat. But immediate rescue isn't a sure thing. Flight suits provide only limited protection against severe cold or heat. Survival kits may be damaged or lost during bailout, and in any case, they provide only a temporary supply of food and water. Successful evaders often have to find their own ways of dealing with basic physiological stresses, beginning with hunger and thirst.
And you get thirsty, your throat gets very dry. And one thing that the RAF taught us was if you don't have water, take a handful of small gravel and put it in your mouth. This induces the saliva to flow. It fools your stomach into thinking you're going to eat. But that was many a day that was very good. You just were to the point where you thought you couldn't breathe anymore. You're being so thirsty.
One of our men kept talking about being thirsty and needing a drink of water, and I think he talked himself into somewhat of a feeling that maybe he was going to die of thirst. And he finally reached a point where he would drink out of the stream.
You don't know what hunger is. On the marches, we had nothing, only what we could carry, which wasn't very much. And if we stayed overnight at a farm, I'd try to sneak in the barn, camp as close to the barn as could get, sneak in and steal some wheat. And usually they had a grinder there. It looked like a coffee grinder. I remember my granddad had one in the store. And we'd put the wheat in there and turn the wheel a few times, and it'd come out like mush or wheatina or something like that. And we boiled it down. It tastes pretty good.
Most of the fellas lost a lot of weight, and psychologically, this was bad because we weren't used to the idea, hey, we don't get fed every day, 3 meals, and the concern about, well, am I going to get any more food? It gave you the butterflies in the stomach.
The woman gave me some food, and then she gave me the crust of bread and jelly on it, and I put it in the pocket of this suit coat that somebody had given me. And the next morning I'm standing in front of a puddle, and I took that crust out, and this guy had been a pipe smoker, covered with burnt tobacco. Now, up to this time, if I saw a thumbprint on a plate, get me a clean plate. And I'm holding this thing, and I'm trying to brush the tobacco off, knocked it out of my hand into the mud puddle. And I picked it up, and I shook it, and I'm saying, mud, they tell you there's water, you got to watch out for typhoid. Burnt tobacco, I'm hungry, I ate it.
Survival studies show that variations in body temperature can have devastating effects. Exposure to heat and the sun can cause weakness, lethargy, dehydration, and severe burns, and it can result in heat stroke. Cold causes intense discomfort and dulls the mind and will. It can cause frostbite, leading to serious infection or the loss of a limb, and eventually death.
Well, we were uncomfortably cold during the night, and we tried everything we knew how to keep warm. And one night a Frenchman put us in a haystack, and someone had hollowed out a large, sort of like a room in the middle of the haystack, and we were able to keep warm there, but we were out of the cold at that point. The next night we tried to sleep in an open field by laying boughs of pine needles on the ground, huddling up and trying to keep close together, but we finally got so cold that we just decided that we might as well keep walking. So we just got up and kept going all night.
I had to keep moving. My feet were soaking wet all the time. It was 5 above 0. I had to make my shoulders moving all the time because my shoes and socks, everything was soaking wet. And if I stopped, they'd freeze solid.
Well, the first night was pretty cold in the cowshed, and my shoes, our leather shoes don't turn water when you're walking in a couple of inches like those wooden shoes do. And so my shoes were pretty wet, my feet were wet, I couldn't get them dried up. And so I couldn't tolerate those cold feet. And so I was in this cowshed, and I laid down in a manger and covered it up with some hay. And being an old farm boy, I didn't mind cattle. And a big heifer laid down over there close to the close, and so I just took my shoes off and put them underneath of her. And got warm. That helped me.
Yes, I was really miserable. There was ice everywhere. I'd covered up with icy leaves, and yes, it was. I was absolutely miserable. All I could do is work my toes and my hands to try to keep circulation. I could not. I was so weak I couldn't stand up. That was the most frightening part of the whole thing. I saw the man down there. I said, "I'm gonna get up now. It's dark enough." I couldn't get up. I simply didn't have the strength.
Fatigue and sleep deprivation often affect survivors by limiting their abilities to plan and move, and by intensifying the effects of other stresses like cold, dehydration, and fear.
The feet were getting worse, and as I say, I was sopping wet most of the time. I remember the night that I'd found a deserted house, had a concrete floor, and I said, "Oh, it's dry." I went in, but you'd ever lay on a wet concrete floor. That was worse. So I just got up and I'm walking through the mud. There wasn't a road even there. And I was just getting very tired.
I had to crawl upstairs after that experience. I could not walk.
Our last night, and this was the middle of April, and we were waist deep in snow. And we were above the clouds and struggling to get to the top of the mountains to start down into Spain. And we stopped for a rest, and the Spaniard said, not going on. He was completely out of it, said he couldn't make it. So at that point, I couldn't see leaving him on the mountainside. That would really hurt. And so I took one of these benzarine pills, and with snow melting some water, I gave him one of them. And then Ken Shaver and I split the other one. And and this was a trying thing. And then after a while, we got him up, and we got him over. We didn't leave him out there. But you know, there were only half of us that got as far as the foothills of the Pyrenees that got through and into Spain. And many were recaptured. And there were fights, people drowned, all kinds of things happened. But many of them just physically gave up, and so they were usually recaptured.
Successful evaders have to handle major psychological and physiological stress, and they have to do it in enemy territory in a way that avoids detection by the enemy. Concealment generally means using camouflage and finding a good hiding place.
When I hit the ground, as I said, our instructions were to bury our chute. Well, I was going to bury my chute, and of course the ground was frozen and couldn't do that, so I knew I had to get out of there fast. And we came into just a little swale there with a group of trees. There's just kind of small trees. I guess it was 100 feet long, maybe it's 80 feet wide. And when we got to that, it's just kind of a briar patch. I dropped that piece and I dived into those briars. Boy, they were just scratching me, and I went right on into it. And I went down about halfway and cut across and came right out to the edge of it, and there was a little depression. So I just lay down and started throwing leaves on top of it, cover me up. And that's where I stayed all afternoon.
Cliff and I left that morning before daylight and arrived at this farm, big, huge place. And we got in the barn, and it was full of bales of straw stacked up. And we crawled way up on top, and by shuffling the bales around that were on the top, we could make a room there about maybe 7 by 7, 8 by 8. And we each had a blanket. We stayed there for 2 or 3 days. We had a little wine left too, that helped.
In Paris, we got off the train and went into the subway, and got off the subway and went to a school area. And this was a Catholic setup, and they owned a whole block. And they had schools, they had their church, and so forth in this. And they took us down into the basement of one of the school buildings, main building. And they generated their own electricity and so forth. And they were hiding us in a stairwell. The other 4 men were already there. And we hadn't been there but a little bit. And here we hear those German boots on the in the hallway above us. And they came, and a steel door, and they were going to come in, but the door was locked. And so the janitor that was escorting them said he didn't have the key. That got us around, and the door had a sign on it, "Stay out, danger high voltage, danger of death." Younger priest came in and told us that Father Superior and the janitor were being arrested, that we had to get out. And so by two, we left. Next day, 4 of the 8 were arrested. 2, a pilot and his waist gunner, they got away, and they came across out of Normandy. Ken Shaver and I just kept walking straight south as far as we could. And we walked about 25 kilometers before it was dark enough we had to get off.
During World War II, many evaders further disguised themselves with civilian clothes and false identification papers, even though they risked being shot as spies.
They tried to dress us as inconspicuously as possible, but yet at that time in France, there were parts of uniforms from the military, clothes, old clothes from almost as far back as World War I. So anything goes, and nothing stood out in a crowd. So you were not real conspicuous no matter what you wore.
The fellow that ran the bar was also a forger on the side. And I don't mean it as an occupation, I mean something he'd picked up. And he had, they broke into German offices and stole rubber stamps and copied them from back. And they had, everything was stamped legal, you know. So they learned to sign names, so they were a good deal similar to the originals, things like that. I had all those papers.
We had a certificate de travail, which was a work certificate showing you were gainfully employed. Otherwise, you would be shipped off to Germany or Austria or some forced labor camp. And then we had a German certificate that permitted us to be in the coastal defense zone, because otherwise, what are you doing in this within X miles of the coast?
We figured that if we were caught, that they would kill us. And also, we were told by the commandant, do not worry that the Germans will ever kill you. We will see to it that you're never captured because you're tortured. Somebody, each one of you, somebody has a bullet for you. So here I get goosebumps when I remember that.
Successful evaders often have to do more than survive and conceal themselves. They have to go somewhere. whether the destination is a coastal area, a territory occupied by friendly forces, a national border, or a prearranged pickup point, both navigation and movement bring their own challenges. GPS instruments ease navigation, but these instruments, like survival kits, may be damaged or lost during bailout.
As far as I could tell, the most useful thing in there was a compass. And we had, I think in each kit there were 2 or 3 little ones, and ones you could hide and one that were bigger so that you could just, you could actually read them. But the little fellows were pretty tough to read. But generally speaking, you needed some kind of guidance. The map was of such a broad scale that the best map we had was given to us by the French natives, of people of the region. We'd come up with a map and point out directions where you were. Even though you had a language barrier, you still could communicate by pointing to a map and indicating where you wanted to go. So I felt that the maps in the escape kit were great for souvenirs. We gave them to the people that helped us.
They were too detailed. If they were a little simpler, and we did draw maps, but they were just big cities we knew, and the rivers and like that. We had compasses that was in the escape kit. Oh, actually, they were part of our metal buttons on to hold up our pants. You know the flying suit was sheepskin, and they were heavy. You couldn't just belt them. You had to have suspenders. But those buttons would snap off, and by arranging them in a proper way, it was a compass.
I figured the only thing I can do is try and head south and try and get down across the Pyrenees. And I figured I can, if I walk, because being January, of course it's dark most of the time, and I would say I will walk when people are going to work, and I can walk close to a group but not be part of it, and nobody will notice me. And then at night I could do the same as they were going home. And that was about the only plan I had, was head south.
Movement increases the risk of detection and can be made exceedingly difficult by weather and terrain.
I had a pair of shoes that had a crack across the sole, and every time I took a step it pinched the bottom of my foot, and I got so stiff from walking awkwardly that I could hardly stand up. The backs of my legs were just, muscles were just pulled out of shape, and that was pretty miserable because I couldn't get a pair of shoes that fit.
We rode the train all night, and this man came through, and he told us the Gestapo was checking the cars above. We didn't have anything, no passports or anything, no identification cards. And one boy had an old rusty knife. He said, here's what we're going to do. He said, you're over there on that side. He gave me that knife. He says, the one that comes in here, we're going to grab him, we're going to here, and the other one we're going to give him, and you're going to stab him. I had that old knife, and I had the whole, I'll tell you, I was scared. My hand was just sweating. I guess I'd have done it. I know I would. That's all we had. But thank goodness it never happened.
I had never been on a train in Europe, and I didn't realize that they didn't take up the tickets till you got off and this kind of stuff. A lot of mistakes I made, but turned out all right. I had a fake passport, naturally. But when I got off the train at night in Venlo, and I thought the man would be checking passports, I didn't realize he would be taking up tickets. I got within 12 feet of this German soldier, and I realized that he was collecting tickets. Too late to go fishing in my pockets for a ticket at that point. And I had this fake passport in my hand expecting to show it. So I just used a brazen approach and flashed that in his face and walked on by. I guess they had so many people, Germans, riding on passes and so on, that he thought I was one of them.
And then we went up on the street and then went down and got on the subway, and we got pushed in, and I ended up standing on a German soldier officer's insteps. We're nose to nose, and he's glaring at me. and I'm trying to look innocent like I don't know I'm on his feet. And it was an express train. Seemed to go forever. But finally went to a station and I could back off, so now we're this far apart. And then he finally got off. And then when we got off, I told the Frenchman, I was standing on his feet. He says, good, he thought you were a Frenchman.
During World War II, Allied evaders in Europe received help from several underground networks. But not all natives of Nazi-occupied countries supported the Allies. Instead, collaborators often turned Allied flyers over to the Nazis for handsome rewards, so evaders had to think twice before approaching a native.
There were a lot of collaborators. You know, they could get several $100 for turning a guy in.
I would stop, though, and I would pick houses, and I would say, I figured that anybody that had anything had to be a collaborator. So I'd go to a house where they looked poor and knock on the door, je suis Americain, and some would let you in, give you a little food.
They told us not to go to the big houses. Those were often occupied by Germans, and that turned out to happen to us in France. And to try to approach people, if possible, your first contacts, do it where you're on a one-on-one and not outnumbered. The group that went across before we were supposed to go across out of the Dutch-Paris line, that group had a plant, and the individual, when they stopped to rest for the night, an individual went back, and so they Germans came up and they were armed and so on, and they killed several people out of that group.
The guy spoke Oxford English. I mean, I thought he did. It sounded that way to me. And he was very congenial, very friendly, knew the people were who were later executed. And he said, you're going to Paris, and I'm going to drive you all the way to Paris. Went to a roadblock. Took us right into Gestapo headquarters from there.
After deciding to approach a native, an evader typically found it difficult to communicate. American flyers rarely spoke the language of the countries over which they flew.
I couldn't speak French. If I could have spoken French, I would have given anything to.
Well, I'd taken French in high school, but I passed with a 67. And I think she only passed me to get rid of me. And when I was in France and had to speak it, I got so I could speak it quite well.
The first thing I did was approach a farm couple in whose farmyard I landed, and I couldn't communicate with them because I later found out that some of them didn't even speak French. They spoke Breton. No, I certainly didn't understand any Breton, but I didn't understand a word of French. But we didn't understand a lot of the things that were going on with in the community, within the people would gather in the schoolhouse and talk about us and talk about what was going to happen, and we really didn't understand. And it was very frustrating to be in, and you had to have complete trust in the people that were, well, you knew their life was on the line, and so therefore you had no alternative but to trust them.
From the viewpoint of a native of an enemy-occupied land, the approach of what appeared to be an Allied evader was a fearful event. Nazi occupiers gave strict instructions that all Allied airmen must be captured and turned in at once, on pain of death. Underground members knew they faced particularly horrendous consequences if they were discovered. The announced punishment for them was to shoot all males in the household and send all females to concentration camps. Compounding the fear of discovery for underground members and other natives were the many moles, English-speaking enemy agents who impersonated down flyers, infiltrated the underground, and turned hundreds of helpers over to the Nazis.
The men were shot right on the spot, closest brick wall. The women were sent to Ravensbrück, which was concentration camp for women. About half of them died there.
If they helped me, they could be tortured, the whole family could be shot.
Well, I hate to think of it, but I've heard so many stories. They would have probably killed the people that helped me or put them in concentration camps, and yeah, it was terrible. I just, yes, it would. They would. One boy told me that they had 16 boys and girls in that area, and they couldn't find. I don't know what it was, me or some of the others, but he said they lined them up and shot them.
People don't realize how great the sacrifice was. The man, for example, that took me from Amsterdam to Venlo, he was later captured and apparently executed on the spot. No trial or anything. Yoko was captured later. They never knew for everything. She survived. But in the final analysis, for every one of us that got out of Holland, the people of Holland paid with 3 lives.
Despite the dangers and their many losses, members of the underground continued to feed and clothe Allied evaders and escort them to freedom throughout the war. Successful evasion has always been difficult, and it remains so today. At one time or another, almost all evaders experience injury, sickness, loneliness, and fear. Food and water are usually hard to find, and evaders may go for days without sleep, while hiding in places that are bitterly cold or hot. Many become lost, and most eventually have to risk exposure by communicating with a native who doesn't speak their language, and who may be an enemy collaborator. If evaders are caught in civilian clothes, they risk being shot as spies. Evading is no job for the faint of heart, yet thousands of flyers have shown it's a job that can be done. Openings for this job occur in almost every conflict, but you have to be ready because they come up without warning, and only heroes need apply.